There are many Legend of Zelda games, and a lot of them are very different from one another. You have huge, open adventures like Breath of the Wild, versus games that are much more linear, like Skyward Sword. But which of the 19 main series Legend of Zelda games are the most popular with fans? To find out, I created a survey which has now been filled out by over 7,500 people. Let us find out which Zelda games are the most and least popular. Part 1. Making the survey. So, the first thing I had to do was create a survey where people could rate each of the main Zelda games. But to do that, I had to decide what counts as a main series Zelda game. You have the obvious ones, Zelda 1, Zelda 2, A Link to the Past, etc. But what about spin-off games like Hyrule Warriors or Link's Crossbow Training even? Well, I and erred about whether to include these titles, but eventually I decided no. I want to pit the big main Zelda adventures against each other, and including spin-off games would just get in the way. That still left a few games where it wasn't clear whether they were spin-offs, like Triforce Heroes or Four Swords Adventures. Eventually, I just left it to Wikipedia. Wikipedia includes those games in their list of main series Zelda titles, and I trust Wikipedia. Lastly, I decided to group remakes and remasters alongside their original games so as not to bulk up the list any further. And I split Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages into separate entries on the list. I wasn't sure whether I should at first, but the two games have entirely different puzzles, dungeons, and stories, so by all accounts, they're unique games. Right, that was it. With my decisions made, I now had a final list of 19 Zelda games. I quickly tweeted it out to make sure I hadn't left anything off, and sure enough, Twitter was happy with my work. For the most part. Next, I opened Google Forms and started putting my survey together. Last time I made a survey like this, I asked people to answer I liked this or I didn't like this for each entry, but people told me they wanted more freedom. So this time, you're getting a 5-point scale. Each game you have to rate from 1 to 5. I also added a note telling people not to rate the games they haven't played. Whether everyone will listen is hard to say, but I'm hoping this will make this survey a little more robust. And then, and this part was a bit of a pain, I created 19 individual text boxes where people could leave up to 3 words about each game if they wanted to. That way, we can hopefully delve a little deeper into why people gave the games the ratings they did. And that's it. The survey was now complete. All that was left was for me to send out the link via Twitter and YouTube. And with that done, it was time for the responses to start rolling in. Part 2, a week later. So, I was pretty amazed by the number of responses I got to my survey. We passed 1,000 responses in just a few hours, and by the time a week had passed, the number of responses was over 7,000, which is pretty incredible. Thank you very much to every single person who took part in the survey. So, I have now downloaded the data that Google Forms spat out, and I've fiddled around with it to get a ranked list of every single main series Zelda game. There's also an average score from 1 to 5 for each game, which I will reveal as we go down the list. I'm going to start at the very bottom so that we can end on a nice positive note. So, let's go through which games people ranked as their most and least favourite Zelda entries. Number 19. At the very bottom of the list is, sadly, Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. This is the second game in the Zelda series, and when it was released, it drew huge crowds lining up outside shops around the world. But clearly its status has changed over time. With an average score of 2.22, Zelda 2 falls beneath the critical 2.5 line, which marks the boundary between a positive and negative response. In other words, less people like the game than dislike it. Ouch. Some of people's responses include too hard, cryptic, difficult, grating, bad, different, weird, not even a Zelda game, and black sheep. And yes, Zelda 2 is the black sheep of the series. Even the game's own developers have acknowledged that fact. Shigeru Miyamoto once said, "I wouldn't say that I've ever made a bad game per se, but a game I think we could have done more with was Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link." And when the game's director was told that Zelda 2 has some fans out there, he replied, "Those kind of people exist? Oh dear. Sorry, Zelda 2. Perhaps you were never meant to be." Number 18. In second to last place is Triforce Heroes. This easily forgotten multiplayer Zelda game for the 3DS was heavily themed around fashion. It was certainly unique, but did that win it any favors? Evidently not, as it received an average rating of 2.67, barely over the halfway mark. And the responses people wrote reflect this mix of opinions. Interesting, poor execution, awful single player, fun with friends, convoluted and clumsy, and I think the most apt, you need friends. Because that, I think, is Triforce Heroes' biggest weakness. The game needs 3 players to play as intended. So, if you can round up 2 other 3DS owners to play along with you, you'll probably have a pretty good time. Otherwise, chances are you're not gonna have much fun. Number 17. Next on the list is 4 Swords for the Game Boy Advance. Now, this is more spin-off-y than some of the other games on the list, so perhaps it's not a huge surprise that it only scored 2.81. A lot of the responses just say, "Never played," "I didn't play it," and "Nobody played this." Well, that last one isn't quite true. Some people did play the game, leaving comments like underrated, hectic, short, fun but weird, and again, you need friends. In other words, 4 Swords likely ran into a similar problem to Triforce Heroes. It's a great multiplayer experience, but try playing it without any other players and you're gonna struggle. Number 16. In a shock upset, in 16th place is the original Legend of Zelda, the game that started it all. It received an average rating of 2.99, just below the 3 mark. Honestly, I expected this game to be quite a lot higher up on the list, but I am not the one in charge here. If you look through people's responses, you can see why the game ended up so low down on the list. Need a map? Didn't age well. Cryptic, boring, difficult. Ouch. Of course, there are plenty of more positive responses too, like expect the unexpected, fun, hard, adventurous, open, mysterious. And I think those comments really do sum up the appeal and lack of appeal of the original Legend of Zelda. It's hard, really hard, and it doesn't help you out at all if you're struggling. But if you push through that difficulty, there is a really exciting adventure to be had. That being said, it's too hard for me, so I've never gotten very far through. Number 15. Next is a game I'm not going to dwell on for too long, and that is 4 Swords Adventures for the GameCube. This is a beefed up sequel to the original 4 Swords multiplayer game, and it received a rating of 3.00, just edging out the original Legend of Zelda by 1 decimal place. This game really inherits a lot of the strengths and weaknesses of its predecessor. Underrated fun party, best GameCube co-op, and also, you need friends. And my favourite response, punched my brother. Number 14. Next on the list is Phantom Hourglass for the DS, with a score of 3.07. This was the first Zelda game with 3D graphics released on a handheld device. But because that handheld device was the DS, the game also made use of some pretty clunky touch controls. And a lot of the criticism directed towards the game revolved around that control scheme. Weird to control, says one person. Great, but stylus, says another. And the game had one other divisive aspect. A dungeon called the Temple of the Ocean King that he had to return to again and again and again. Ruined by Ocean King, says one person. I like how they cleverly managed to fit that into 3 words. Ocean King. But that was far from the only response that mentioned the Ocean King. This temple is very unpopular, not unlike the game itself. Number 13. Interestingly, next on the list is Spirit Tracks, the direct sequel to Phantom Hourglass. The whole game is themed around riding trains across the land of Hyrule, and I really like this game, I have to admit. It's another very original and perhaps divisive Zelda adventure, but I personally think that originality paid off. With a score of 3.09, however, players seem to be more divided. Great, but stylus again, says one response, while some of the others say, cruelly underrated, I like trains, and even stupid train shit. Ouch. So, whether you enjoy this game really comes down to whether you're willing to accept the idea of a railway-based Zelda game. And I know that I am. Choo-choo! Oh, okay. Number 12 and 11. Next on the list, in 12th and 11th place, is a pair of Zelda games for the Game Boy, neither of which were developed by Nintendo, Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. The games were actually developed by Capcom, and much like the Pokemon games, both Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages were released at the same time. Unlike Pokemon though, the stories, characters and puzzles from the 2 games are original. These are definitely 2 distinct Zelda games. Of the 2, Seasons comes out slightly ahead with a score of 3.17, beating out Ages' score of 3.15. Unfortunately though, most of the responses to both of the games just say, never played it. Number 10. Next on the list is another handheld game, the Minish Cap. Much like the Oracle games, Minish Cap was developed by Capcom, not Nintendo. And with an average rating of 3.68, people seem to enjoy Capcom's take on the world of Zelda. I mean, hands down, this is my favourite pixel art from the entire Zelda series. Best 2D Zelda, says one response. Cute and charming, says another. Overall, the Minish Cap marks a fun and cute entry in the Zelda canon. Number 9. Finally, we're down to the top 9. And in 9th place is 2011's Skyward Sword. This game is known for its extremely linear structure. Unlike some of the more open Zelda games, in Skyward Sword, you have to do exactly what the game wants you to do when it wants you to do it. And perhaps as a result of this, the game scored 3.70 in the survey. That's not a bad score, and Skyward Sword's not a bad game. Underrated masterpiece, says one person, while another writes, hate undeserved. But with its inflexible structure, alongside some pretty irritating motion controls, here's the response I think best sums up the game. Flawed, but fun. Number 8. In 8th place is my personal favourite Zelda game, Link's Awakening. This was the first big Zelda adventure released on handheld devices, and it's really weird. Famously, all kinds of Mario characters appear, like Chain Chomps, Goombas, and even Yoshi. This is one of the most creative Zelda titles, and it earned a respectable score of 3.87. Taking a look at the responses, people described the game as great, character-driven, impressive given limitations, and even phenomenal. Because Link's Awakening is definitely not perfect. For instance, because the Game Boy only had 2 buttons, you were constantly having to swap out items from your inventory. Plus, the game is super linear, which isn't always a bad thing, but Zelda's about exploring off on your own, and you don't do a lot of that in this game. But no, the thing I think that makes Link's Awakening my personal favourite Zelda game is its charm. It's just so full of tiny little touches that make the world feel alive. Not bad for a Game Boy game. Number 7. Now, in 7th place is a bit of a shock. Classic Zelda fans, cover your ears, because with a score of 3.88, next on the list is A Link to the Past. This is one of the most important Zelda games ever. More than that, one of the most important video games ever. I definitely expected to see A Link to the Past higher up on the list. And to be honest, people's 3-word responses don't really shed any more light on this great upset. Aged like wine, still holds up, greatest 2D Zelda, peak 2D Zelda. And yet, according to people's responses, there are 6 better games still to come. I'm very curious to see what beat out this legendary game. Number 6. Next is a close relative of the previous entry, A Link Between Worlds. Now, A Link Between Worlds is set in the same version of Hyrule as A Link to the Past. You can lay the 2 games' world maps over each other and they line up perfectly. But with a score of 3.96, people filling out the survey actually slightly preferred A Link Between Worlds over A Link to the Past, describing the game as a masterpiece, really unique puzzles, return to form, and even better than original. Number 5. We're now down to the top 5, and in 5th place is Twilight Princess. At the time of its release, Twilight Princess was viewed by many Zelda fans as a return to form for the Zelda series, telling a more serious story of Link becoming a wolf. With a score of 4.09, most fans remain fond of Twilight Princess, describing it as having an amazing story, great adventure, says somebody else, and I think the most apt, edgy but cool. From the game's world to its story and characters, Twilight Princess is really edgy, which perhaps turned off some fans. Too edgy is a response I saw multiple times. But on the whole, most players agree that Twilight Princess is a fun relic of an era where edge was at the top of players' wish lists. And Twilight Princess certainly delivered on that. Number 4. Next on the list is Majora's Mask, with an average score of 4.18. And if Link's Awakening is the strangest Zelda game, then Majora's Mask is perhaps the darkest. While Twilight Princess tried very hard to look and feel like a big grown-up adventure, Majora's Mask actually handles darker and more interesting themes, and is dripping with unsettling atmosphere in every location you visit. And with a deliberately claustrophobic 3-day repeating time loop, Majora's Mask is the most unique Zelda game that Nintendo has ever released. And I'm not alone in that opinion. Just looking at the very first 4 responses, we have Best Game Ever, Best Game, The Best One, and Best Zelda Game. Obviously, not everyone agrees with that, as Majora's Mask sits in 4th place. But to say this is one of the most acclaimed Zelda games is an understatement. Number 3. In 3rd place is The Wind Waker, with a score of 4.21. And that's super interesting to see. When The Wind Waker was first revealed to the public, the reaction to it was extremely negative, especially in the United States. After Majora's Mask, fans were expecting another dark and gritty entry in the Zelda series. It was, therefore, a bit of a shock when this is what was revealed to them. A vibrant, cartoon-like take on Zelda. At the time, that was considered a bad thing. But as the years have passed, The Wind Waker's unique art style has actually become its greatest asset. Timeless art style, says one respondent. Fun graphics, says somebody else. But it's not just pretty shading that's made Wind Waker so popular. Here's my favorite response that I saw. Sense of adventure. I think that is Wind Waker's greatest strength. Number 2. In 2nd place, with a score of 4.23, is a game that has been described by many as the greatest game of all time. It is, of course, Ocarina of Time, perhaps the most influential video game of the 1990s. Honestly, I'm not sure what to say about Ocarina of Time that hasn't been said better before. The game is practically flawless, with an ambitious and perfectly executed story that takes place through time. Its dungeons are creepy and atmospheric, its action is so good you would never know that Ocarina of Time was the game that laid the blueprints for hundreds of action games that followed. It is practically impossible to believe that Nintendo managed to get so much right when this was their first attempt at bringing Zelda into the third dimension. This game is an incredible achievement. I can't say that enough. And yet, there was one game that knocked Ocarina of Time off its pedestal. Number 1. Over the last 10 minutes, we've now talked about 18 of the 19 Zelda games on the list I made. It should be pretty obvious now what the number 1 Zelda game is. And to be honest, this is the result I expected before I even started putting this survey together. With an incredibly high score of 4.55, which means that more people gave this game a 5 than any other score, in first place is Breath of the Wild. If Ocarina of Time is hard to talk about, then I don't know what on earth to say about Breath of the Wild. I really do believe that Breath of the Wild is the greatest video game of all time right now. No other game captures that sheer sense of adventure like it. Nothing else comes close. The feeling of hang gliding away from the Great Plateau for the first time and realizing just how vast the land of Hyrule is. And that you really can just walk to any part of it whenever you want. I don't think any other video game has ever captured a feeling quite like it. And scrolling through people's responses, I'm bombarded with the words best and greatest again and again. Genre-defining masterpiece. Amazing open world. Breathtaking. Perfect. Revolutionary. Greatest game ever. And I honestly think they're right. Breath of the Wild might not be perfect, but I can't think of any game that gets closer to perfect than Breath of the Wild does. Phew, that is the entire survey finally gone through. Here's all the games and the scores they received. Feel free to pause and take a look through if you're curious. And I'll also link the survey data in the description in case anyone wants to examine it in more detail. Thank you again to every single person who filled out this survey. I've had a really fun time going through all the responses. And if you disagree with the rankings, let me know what you think should have been number 1. But you have to give a 3-word justification of it, because they're fun to read through. Thank you also to my kind patrons who help support my work financially. YouTube is not super stable, and your extremely generous contributions really help with that. Okay, I think that is everything. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you're not already, because I make videos like this pretty much every week. And on that note, I shall see you next time. Bye!